Cuba is on edge. Blackouts, food shortages, no fuel, and constant threats from its neighbor.
Cuba is right now a failed nation. Taking Cuba.
It may not be a friendly takeover, it wouldn't matter.
Cuba is ready to fall.
Decades of tensions are about to boil over. Is Cuba's time running out? This is life in Cuba right now. Nationwide blackouts, affecting the island's whole population, more than 10 million people. Without power, hospitals have had to cancel surgeries. And garbage is piling up. There's no gas for the garbage trucks or for almost anyone else.
No podemos más porque la situación de Cuba es muy difícil.
Se echa a perder todo lo que tiene frío. Todo se echa a perder. La carne, la leche, el niño,
They're getting maybe 18 hours of blackouts, 6 hours of electricity a day. That electricity can come at like midnight, it can come at 3 in the morning. And so Cubans are waking up in the middle of the night to get the rice cooked, to get water boiled, to make coffee, to charge everything.
That's Sarah Cosame. Her latest research trip to Cuba was in February 2026.
What I observed was the disruption in daily life that is sort of hard to imagine for us.
Cuba's energy system relies on oil, but the US has cut off Cuba's main oil supplies. First from Venezuela by taking control of its oil sales. And then from Mexico by threatening the country with tariffs. Media reports suggest that the US has even been physically blocking oil tankers from elsewhere from getting to Cuba. It's all part of the pressure the US is building on Cuba, claiming the regime there poses a threat to US security. And after US actions in Venezuela and Iran, Cuba could be Trump's next target.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah. Taking Cuba. I mean, whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it.
This is absolutely an escalation, the most tense moment in modern Cuban history.
But wait, doesn't the US already control part of Cuba? This is Guantanamo Bay, roughly the size of Paris, and the US only pays a few $1,000s a year for it. It's now known for the notorious prison camp. But the US naval base here actually goes back to what happened in 1898. That's when the US helped push out Cuba's Spanish colonizers, only to occupy the island itself. Cuba's independence, a few years later, came with a catch, or several. One US demand: a permanent lease for Guantanamo. Cuba actually refuses to cash in the checks the US sends for it. Because for many Cubans, Guantanamo is a symbol of more than a century of mistrust. But for the US, that mistrust really starts with this guy, Fidel Castro. He led the Cuban Revolution in 1959, overthrowing a US-backed dictatorship. Fidel Castro ruled Cuba for decades. During this time, the US allegedly hatched 600 plots on his life, once with an exploding cigar. When Castro came to power, his government quickly started seizing US-owned oil refineries and other US businesses.
Castro's followers carried coffins as symbols of the confiscated companies.
The United States owned a lot in Cuba, and it was unhappy to lose it all.
The US hit back with a trade embargo. It eventually refused to buy or sell almost anything to and from Cuba, hampering the island's economy. By the way, Kennedy is said to have stocked up on over 1,000 Cuban cigars first. The US already feared a communist neighbor on its doorstep. It turned to direct action against Cuba. and supported CIA-trained Cuban exiles in an infamous invasion at the Bay of Pigs. Castro's forces repelled them, a huge fail for the US. Castro built an autocratic socialist state. And the US, the poster child of capitalism, kept expanding its embargo.
The embargo also quickly took on a kind of a geopolitical importance in light of Cuba's growing alliance with the Soviet Union, starting in the early 1960s.
This is Michael Bustamante, a Cuban-American historian at the University of Miami.
The Soviet Union stepped in to provide significant economic assistance.
But remember, this was the Cold War, and tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were high. Those tensions peaked in 1962, in a moment that still defines how the US looks at Cuba. A US spy mission discovered a nuclear missile launch site and realized Cuba had allowed the Soviet Union to station nuclear-armed missiles across the island. The missiles could have struck this far into US territory.
Of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
The world was on the brink of nuclear war.
A nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
But then came a deal, which included the Soviets taking the missiles off Cuba and the US promising not to invade. Still, the US and Cuba weren't exactly ready to kiss and make up.
I think over time, different U.S. administrations have seen economic and political isolation of the Cuban government and the Cuban economy as a way to create conditions that would be propitious for political change to emerge from within.
Barack Obama took a different approach. He lifted some restrictions on Cuba and became the first US president to visit in the best part of a century. And Cuba got a new leader, Raúl, the younger brother of Fidel Castro. Fidel died a few years later, aged 90, of natural causes, by the way. These changes created a window of opportunity for the relationship to improve. But a decade later, it's only gotten worse.
Cuba is right now a failed nation.
Let's go to Havana. Well, Little Havana in Miami, Florida. The US state of Florida is only around 150 kilometers from Cuba. Cuban migrants have crossed this gap for decades, fleeing poverty or Cuba's regime. That's a typical family history for Cuban Americans, around 1.5 million of whom live in Florida today. And most of them are against Cuba's communist leadership.
Un régimen que nos ha despojado de todo.
El único arreglo que tiene es botarlos a ellos de ahí. El comunismo es una plaga mala.
Many here voted for Trump and are loyal to the Republican Party. So when the Republicans talk about Cuba, they're also appealing to Cuban American voters.
U.S.-Cuba policy has never just been about foreign policy, it's also domestic politics.
And this guy is the most powerful Cuban American, Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State.
His political education and sentimental education was in a Cuban diaspora. There's been a consistent interest on his part in seeing radical change in Cuba.
Here's Rubio facing questions from Democrats on his views.
Will you make a public commitment today to rule out U.S. regime change in Cuba?
Regime change?
Yes.
Oh, no, I think we would love to see the regime there change. We would like to, that doesn't mean that we're going to make it change, but we would love to see it change. There's no doubt about the fact that it would be of great benefit to the United States if Cuba was no longer governed by an autocratic regime.
And now could be Rubio's chance, alongside this president.
I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba.
I think more than anything else for this administration, this is about being able to plant the flag and say, for the president in particular, to say, I did that thing that no other predecessor could. I defeated Cuban communism. Whether he gets there is the open question.
But we've already seen how far Trump and his administration are willing to go. These are the remains of Cuban soldiers who were killed when US forces kidnapped Nicolás Maduro. They'd been assigned to protect the Venezuelan leader. Because to Cuba, Venezuela wasn't just some other Spanish-speaking Caribbean neighbor. Since the early 2000s, Venezuela has been something like Cuba's socialist brother. It helped Cuba overcome an economic crisis after Cuba's biggest ally, the Soviet Union, collapsed in 1991. Venezuela and Cuba shared a political vision. But their relationship wasn't just ideological, it was also practical. Cuba relied heavily on Venezuelan oil for its energy, but also to sell it elsewhere for cash. In return, Cuba sent highly trained medical staff to Venezuela. And remember the Cuban soldiers who were killed? They were among the many security officers Cuba sent for years to help Venezuela's government maintain its grip on power.
I think it was strategically important for both of them.
With Maduro's capture, the US destroyed that alliance.
I think that has obviously created a huge problem for Cuba because they were relying on the petroleum that Venezuela sent.
So was the US intervention in Venezuela actually about weakening Cuba?
I think that's been the goal all along. For Marco Rubio, Venezuela was absolutely about Cuba. His goal is absolutely to finish off the Cuban, whatever you would like to call it, the revolution or socialism, the Cuban system, the political system.
Russia is offering Cuba support. It has sent some much-needed oil to the island and says the US oil blockade is suffocating Cuba's economy. China sent rice to help Cuba with food shortages. It's pledged more support with solar projects to combat the blackouts. China's helped Cuba build dozens of solar parks in recent years.
Those ties are real, right? China and Russia have been important economic partners of Cuba. What's less clear is the bit about security and intelligence cooperation. Allegations of Chinese intelligence and listening posts in Cuba has been the subject of a lot of speculation.
But what we know for sure, the US under Trump wants other superpowers out of the Western Hemisphere. It sees this part of the world as its own backyard, where it calls the shots.
This administration, particularly the second Trump administration, has really articulated a vision of the world that really talks about the revival of US spheres of influence.
The question is what that means for Cuba's future. Its president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, has said Cuba and the US are talking. But there's still fear of a US military intervention.
En primer lugar, reconocemos que puede haber una agresión a Cuba y hemos desatado un plan de preparación para elevar la disposición para la defensa de nuestro pueblo.
There are multiple scenarios that can play out. I think, hopefully the most unlikely one is military attack on Cuba. Another possibility is a scenario similar to Venezuela's where the leader is removed and somebody else who just agrees to do what the US wants is put in.
My concern is the longer this drags out, my concern is that the Cuban people are caught in the middle.
Cuba has long been a place the US wants under its thumb. But what's different now is a US administration prepared to go all the way.